I said that to my brother Holt the morning after the wedding. We were standing by the fence post out back, the one I'd set myself, tamping the clay down hard with the butt of a fence digger because I didn't own a proper pounder yet. That was 3 years after I'd come to this valley, 3 years after I stopped. Holt laughed, said I made it sound like settling was a defeat. I told him it was the opposite. I told him settling is what a man does when he finally figures out the difference between running towards something and running away from it. I'd been doing the second kind for most of my adult life, and I never even knew it until a woman named Clara Beecham looked at me across a supper table and didn't look away. But I'm getting ahead, I always do. It's how a man tells a story when it ended well. He wants to get to the good part before he earns it. Let me back up to the beginning, which wasn't here, wasn't even close to here. The beginning was a place called Pease River Country, down in North Texas, and I was 22 years old and I had a horse, a rifle, $60 in my boot, and a considerable amount of anger I didn't know what to do with. My father had sold the family land to pay a debt that turned out not to be his, or at least that's what I believed at the time. I was wrong about some of that, but I wouldn't find out how wrong until much later, and by then I'd already gotten so used to moving that staying felt like a kind of death. I rode up through the territory with a man named Cassius Dell, who was not my friend exactly, but was the sort of man you travel with because the road is long and silence gets heavy after the third day. Cassius was lean and dark-eyed and had a way of looking at the horizon like it owed him something. He'd done some things I won't name. I'd done some things I won't name. We didn't talk about any of it, which suited us both. We picked up work where we could. Cattle drives mostly. 2 seasons on the trail to Abilene. 1 winter working for a stage line out of Pueblo, which sounds dignified but mostly meant you sat on a cold box and got shot at by men who'd done the same arithmetic you did and decided robbery was easier than labor. We weren't outlaws, Cassius and me. We were just men who hadn't found anything worth being honest for. That's a hard thing to admit. I'm admitting it now because it's true and because Clara would want me to tell it straight. I was good at 2 things, reading country and handling horses. The first is something some men are born with and most aren't. You look at a draw and you know whether water runs through it in spring. You watch a line of cottonwoods and you know where the creek bends. You feel the grass under your horse's feet and you know whether it was grazed or whether it's never been touched. The second thing, horses, is patience. That's all it is. People make it mystical, but it's just patience and the willingness to be wrong and try again. I didn't apply either of those skills to my own life. Not then. We drifted north and west, not following anything, not running from anything specific, though there was a man in Comanche County who'd have been unhappy to see me, and there was a woman in Wichita whose husband had come back from a cattle drive earlier than expected, and there were a few other circumstances that made the northern territories feel more appealing than they might have otherwise. Cassius said one night, somewhere in what would become Kansas, that we were like tumbleweeds. Said the country just moved us around and we didn't have enough route to stop. I told him that was romantic nonsense. He said I was the least romantic man he'd ever met. I told him that was probably true. By the time I was 27, I'd been to 12 territories. I'd worked more jobs than I can name, most of them honest, a few of them bent. I'd been shot once in the meat of my left shoulder by a man in a dispute over a card game I wasn't even in. The bullet went through clean and I packed the hole with flour and kept moving. I'd been in 2 floods, 1 fire, and a buffalo stampede that I survived by falling off my horse and landing in a dry creek bed, and lying very still, while several hundred tons of animal ran over me close enough that the wind from them moved my hair. I tell you all this not because any one thing matters, but because that was what I was made of by the time I came into the Cimarron Valley. I was a man built from movement. I didn't know how to be still. I came to the valley in the autumn of 1878. I was 29 years old and I was alone. Cassius had gone south to Tucson with a woman he'd met in Dodge, and I won't say I missed him because that wouldn't be quite honest, but I noticed his absence the way you notice a tooth gone, not pain exactly, just a strange hollow where something used to be. I'd heard about the valley from a freighter I'd helped pull out of a mud bog the previous spring. He described it the way a man describes a place he loves but hasn't been back to, something almost painful in his voice, a tenderness he couldn't quite hide. Good grass, water that didn't run dry, winters that were hard but honest. A town coming up, he said, people trying to make something real. I rode in on a Tuesday. The grass was going brown and gold, and the sky was the particular blue it gets in October up there. A blue so pure it almost hurts. And the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow and blazing, and the mountains north of the valley had the first snow on them. Just a skim of white on the peaks like someone had run a thumb through chalk and dragged it across the rock. I sat my horse at the top of the east ridge and looked at it for a long time. I told myself I was just stopping to rest, told myself I'd be gone by spring. That was my lie to myself. I got pretty good at lying to myself over the years. The thing is, when you've moved so long, stopping feels like failure, like giving up. Like admitting that all that motion didn't get you anywhere, which of course it hadn't, but if you're still moving, you don't have to face that. I rode down into the valley and found the town, which was called Garrett's Crossing then, later just Garrett, and I found the livery stable, and I found the man who owned it, a thick-set Dutchman named Vander Hoek who squinted at me like he was calculating something. He asked what I could do. I told him horses. He told me his wrangler had broken his arm 2 weeks prior and hadn't come back. I started the next morning. The livery was work I understood. There's a particular piece to it that I hadn't found in much else, the smell of hay and horse sweat and oiled leather, the sound of animals moving in their stalls at night, the rhythm of it, the same tasks in a different order every day, nothing wasted. I was good at it, and Vander Hoek knew I was good at it and left me alone, which was the only condition I asked for in those days. I slept in a room off the back of the stable for the first 2 months. Vander Hoek offered me proper boarding in town once it got cold, but I told him I was fine where I was. Truth is, I didn't want to be around people more than necessary. I'd gotten good at the surface of sociability. I could talk at a bar, play a hand of cards, sit with men, and make the right sounds, but it cost me something. I didn't have words for it then. Clara later told me I'd been armored so long I'd forgotten the armor was there. That's the kind of thing Clara said. Winter was hard that year. The snow came in November and stayed. I worked through it. Horses don't stop needing care because the temperature drops. My hands cracked at the knuckles and bled into the leather I worked with. I wrapped them with strips of flour sack and kept going. The town had maybe 200 people by then, spread along the creek and up the south-facing hillside. There was a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a small hotel, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings. It was the kind of town that was deciding whether it would survive or not, and that decision hadn't been made yet. I knew most people by sight within a month, knew their names by the second month, didn't know much more than that about anyone and didn't try to. There was a homestead about 2 miles east of town, on the good piece of Creek Bottom, one of the better parcels in the valley. It had been claimed by a man named Albert Beecham who'd come up from Missouri with his wife and daughter the previous year. He'd built a solid house, started a kitchen garden, was running a small herd of cattle and some chickens. The kind of man who did things carefully and correctly, which I noticed and respected even though I only saw him a few times. Albert Beecham died in December of that first winter. Heart, they said. He was in the store buying lamp oil and he sat down on the flour sacks and didn't get up. 46 years old. His wife's name was Margaret. His daughter's name was Clara. I knew none of this until February, when Vander Hoek mentioned it while we were mending a stall gate in the cold. Beecham women are still out there, he said, 2 of them running that place alone. I made some neutral sound. Town ought to do more, he said. Nobody does though, men got their own troubles. I went back to work on the gate hinge. That was February. March came in brutal, which it does in the Cimarron Valley. A late storm off the mountains, 3 days of wind that found every gap in the stable walls, and I spent 2 of those nights in the stalls with a mare and foal because I didn't trust her to do it alone in that cold. She was a gray, 16 hands, bad-tempered and smart in equal measure. We understood each other. The foal came on the 3rd night, small and wet and fighting from the first minute. I was bone-tired and frozen, and smelled considerably of horse when I walked into the general store the following morning for coffee, and whatever Hendricks had in the way of food that didn't require cooking. There were 2 women ahead of me at the counter. The older one was small and gray-haired, wearing a coat that had been good once and was being made to last past its time. She was speaking to Hendricks in a careful way, the way a person speaks when they're adding numbers in their head at the same time. The younger one was standing slightly apart, holding a list. She was maybe 24. Brown hair pinned up badly, a strand loose on her neck. A coat that was too light for the weather. She was reading the list with a slight frown, the kind of frown that isn't unhappiness but concentration, the difference between which I wouldn't have been able to name at that exact moment, but which I noticed anyway. She looked up when I came in, straight at me. Not the sliding look people give a stranger, a direct look, the kind that doesn't apologize for itself. Then she went back to her list. I bought my coffee and my salt pork and left. I didn't sleep well that night, which I put down to the mare and the cold and nothing else. I saw her again in April, which is to say Clara, though I didn't yet know that was her name. She was at the stable to collect a horse her father had left there for Vander Hoek to winter, some arrangement predating Albert Beecham's death that I'd never been involved in. A brown gelding, steady and a little stiff in the left fore, nothing serious, just age. I saddled him for her. She watched me do it. Most people don't watch you work. They look away, look at something else, treat what you're doing as invisible. She watched the way you watch someone when you're trying to understand how they do something, not to judge it, but to learn it. I asked if the horse had any trouble that I should know about. She said he favored the left fore in cold weather, but was fine once he warmed up. I said I'd noticed that. She said, "You've been watching him." I said it was my job to watch them. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just present. She said, "My father trusted Vander Hoek with him. I think he'd have trusted you too, from what I can tell." I didn't know what to say to that. I said something like, "Just doing the work," which is what I said when I didn't know what else to say. She nodded, took the gelding's lead, and walked him out. Vander Hoek appeared from behind the tack wall where he'd definitely been eavesdropping, gave me a look, and disappeared again. April went, May came. The valley opened up, the way it does up there, sudden and total, like the land had been holding its breath all winter and finally let it go. The grass came up thick and green, and the creek ran loud with snowmelt, and everything smelled alive in a way that was almost overwhelming after months of cold and gray. I started going out to the Beecham homestead. Not nothing like that. Not at first. It started because their barn needed work. I saw it one afternoon riding back from the east pasture where I'd been chasing a Vander Hoek horse that had broken fence, and the south wall of the barn was leaning, visibly, in a way that meant winter had gotten into the base logs and they were rotting. I didn't think about it for 3 days, then I went. Margaret Beecham answered the door. Small, gray, with the look of a woman who had been surprised by almost nothing since her husband died and was determined to keep it that way. She looked at me for a long moment, then at the tools in my hands. She said, "What do you want for it?" I said I'd take supper. She considered that, then she said, "Come back Saturday." I came back Saturday. I spent the day on the barn wall, pulling the rotted logs, cutting new ones from timber I'd hauled in, tamping and fitting. It was hot work and good work, and I didn't see Clara until the end of the day when she came out with water and stood watching me fit the last log. She said it was better than the original. I said the original had some shortcuts I wouldn't have taken. She said her father had built it himself, mostly alone in a week. I felt that land on me. I said he did a good job for 1 week and mostly alone. She gave me a look that I couldn't read yet. Later I'd learn to read it. Later I'd come to wait for it the way you wait for certain weather, and she said, "Yes, he did." We ate supper. Margaret's cooking was plain and honest, beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork, and I ate 3 helpings and said almost nothing. Clara sat across from me. She talked to her mother about things I half followed, the kitchen garden, the cattle, a problem with the fence along the north line, a letter from a cousin in St. Louis. I watched her while she talked, not in any way I'd be ashamed of, just noticed things, the way she held her spoon, the way she looked at her mother when she was listening, full attention, no distraction. The way she corrected something her mother said about a date, gently, and her mother accepted the correction without a blink, because that was just the way they talked to each other. I rode back to town in the long evening light, and I thought, these are people who built something real. And I thought, you haven't. I kept going out there. Every week or two, whenever I saw something that needed doing. I recut the fence along the north line. I helped clear a block of sod for a new garden bed. I worked their small herd. They had 9 head of decent cattle that needed branding and earmarking, and 1 steer that had gotten into something that made his guts swell up. and I sat with that steer for 2 nights and walked him until it passed, and he was fine. Margaret paid me in meals, and once in a length of good woolen cloth that she said she had no use for, which I accepted because refusing would have been rude. Clara and I talked more, slowly the way two people talk when they're both careful with words when they don't waste them. She'd grown up in Missouri, she said. Her father had always wanted to come west. Her mother had agreed, she said, in the way that wives agreed in those days, not joyfully but not grudgingly either. She'd come because Albert had needed her to come and she had believed in him. I asked Clara if she'd wanted to come. She thought about it, she said. I wanted to want to, by the time we got here I did. I said that was a good answer. She said, what about you? Did you want to come here? I said I hadn't really wanted to come anywhere in particular, said I'd been moving for a while. She asked why. I gave her some version of the story about my father and the land and the debt. It was true as far as it went. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual in my experience. Most people either jump in with a similar story of their own, or they make sympathetic noises that stop you short. She just listened until I was done. Then she said, that sounds like the start of a reason. I'm not sure it's the whole reason. I looked at her. She wasn't being unkind. She was being exact. I said no. Probably not the whole reason. She nodded and went back to weeding the bed she'd been working on, and I went back to the fence post I'd been setting, and neither of us said anything more about it for a long time. That conversation stayed with me. It wouldn't leave. I kept turning it over, the way you work a stone with your thumb, not trying to do anything with it, just feeling the edges. Nobody had ever said that to me, that there might be a reason under the reason, that the story I'd been telling myself might be missing something. June, the valley in full summer. The nights still cool, but the days long and warm, and the grass so thick the horses sank into it up to their fetlocks. I was working with a young horse for Vander Hoek, a 4-year-old that had been badly handled somewhere before he came to us and was half broken from it. Not mean, just scared, which is worse in a way because a mean horse you can work with directly, but a scared horse you have to earn. I'd been at him 4 days. We were getting somewhere. Cassius showed up. I saw him ride into town from the stable door. Knew his posture at 100 yards. Thin in the saddle, loose-handed, that particular way he had of sitting a horse like he expected the horse to disappoint him. He looked like he'd had a hard winter. We ate together at the hotel that evening. He told me about Tucson, about the woman, about how that had ended, which it had ended badly and not entirely his fault, though not entirely not his fault either. He'd been working in Arizona, some of it legitimate, some of it less so. He was thinking about heading up to Montana. He asked what I was doing here. I said working horses. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked around the room, the hotel dining room, plain and low-ceilinged, 4 other men eating in silence, and then back at me. He said, "You're staying." I said I hadn't decided. He said, "Yes, you have. You got that look." I asked what look. He said, "The look like a man who's afraid to say he's staying, because saying it makes it real." I told him that was a considerable amount of interpretation for one dinner. He said, "They're a woman." I didn't answer fast enough. He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh in years, and it sounded different than I remembered, like something that used to be easy about him was gone, and what was left was just the shape of the laugh. He left the next morning for Montana. I watched him ride north out of the valley, up over the East Ridge, and he got small and then smaller, and then he was gone over the ridge, and I stood there at the stable door for a while after. I never saw Cassius again. I got a letter from him 2 years later from Helena saying he'd found work and a woman and was considering, as he put it, the sedentary life. I wrote back but never heard again. July, and I did something that surprised me. I put down money on a parcel. 20 acres on the west side of the valley, mostly good grass, a 1/4 mile of creek running through it, a south-facing slope that would be sheltered from the north wind in winter. No buildings, just land. I paid $200 for it, which was every dollar I'd saved over 8 months plus 40 I borrowed from Vander Hoek against future work. I stood on the parcel the afternoon I signed the papers and looked at the creek and the slope and the grass, and I thought, I am either the smartest thing I've ever done or the most terrified. I didn't tell Clara. I didn't tell anyone for a while. Telling it would make it real, and making it real would mean I couldn't leave, and I still wasn't sure I wasn't going to leave, even though I knew that I wasn't. The armor Clara later talked about, that's what it was. I'd worn it so long I'd started to believe it was skin. I told her in August. We were at the homestead. I'd been helping her move some fence posts to repair a section the cattle had pushed through, and we'd been working together in the heat all morning, and at noon, Margaret brought us food and we sat in the shade of the barn and ate. I said I bought some land. Clara looked at me. I told her where it was. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's a good piece, Creek Bottom, South Slope. My father looked at that piece." I said I knew. Hendricks had mentioned it. She said, "Why are you telling me?" The question landed different than I expected. Not hard or cold, just precise. The same way she said things. She wasn't going to let me slide past the answer. I said, "Because I wanted you to know I'm staying." She looked at me for a long time. I held it. That was the thing about Clara. She looked at you the way very few people look at you, like she was actually trying to see what was there instead of what she'd already decided was there. She said, "You've been here almost a year. Were you not staying before?" I said I wasn't sure before. She said, "What changed?" I didn't answer that directly. I said, "I'm building on it this fall. A house anyway, maybe just the bones of one." She nodded slowly. Margaret called something from the house, and Clara got up and went in, and I sat there in the shade of the barn, and I thought, say it better than that. You have to say it better than that eventually. September. I started building. I'm not a carpenter. I want to be clear about that. I was a man who had done enough physical work over enough years that I could figure out most structural problems if I thought about them long enough and was willing to make mistakes and tear things out and start again. What I built that fall was not beautiful. It was square and solid and would keep out weather, which was all I asked of it. I built it alone mostly. Vander Hoek came out 2 weekends and helped me raise the wall frames. A man named Purvis from the south end of the valley came out once because he saw me struggling with a ridgepole and stopped without being asked. We got it up between us in 2 hours. Clara came out once with her mother on a Sunday afternoon in October when the air smelled of the first real cold coming. They'd brought food. I was working on the window openings, cutting the rough frames. Margaret walked around the outside of the house inspecting it with the look of a woman who had been involved in building houses before and knew what she was looking at. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "The sill plate on the north side is a little high." She was right. I told her I'd fix it. She nodded and went to sit on a rock outcrop with her food and her own thoughts. Clara came and stood in the opening that would be the door. Just stood there, hands in her coat pockets, looking out at the valley from the doorway. The afternoon light was doing what it does in October, going sideways and gold, and the grass was brown and the creek was dark, and the mountains north of us had snow again. She said, "You can see everything from here." I said, "That's why I picked the spot." She said, "My father always said you could tell how a man thought by which way he faced his door." I asked her which way her father had faced his. She said, "South, toward what was coming in. He was always watching for things coming toward him." A pause. "You face east toward the morning." I thought about that. I said, "I spent a long time running west, figured I'd try looking at where I'd been for a while." She turned and looked at me over her shoulder. That look, the one I was starting to wait for. She said, "That's the most honest thing you've said to me." I said, "Probably." She turned back to look at the valley for another moment. Then she stepped back out of the doorframe and started toward where her mother was sitting. Then she stopped and said, without turning around, "It'll be a good house." October. The house wasn't done, but it was close. I was still at the livery, still sleeping in my room off the stable, working on the house in evenings and weekends. One Saturday evening I rode out to the Beecham homestead. I hadn't been called out there. I wasn't bringing tools, I just rode out. Margaret answered the door, looked at me, went back inside and called for Clara. Clara came to the door. She had flour on her hands. I said, "I want to ask you something." She wiped her hands on her apron and waited. I said, "I'm not an easy man. I've been told that enough times that I believe it. I don't say things right the first time, most of the time, and I've been moving so long that I don't know what it looks like to stop correctly. But I've stopped here. I know that now, and I don't want to be stopping alone." She looked at me. I said, I'm asking if you'd consider, I'm asking you to. She said, yes. I said I hadn't finished. She said, I know what you're asking, yes. The flower was still on her hands. She hadn't moved from the doorway. The light inside was from a lamp on the table, and it was behind her so I could only see the shadow of her expression. But her voice had something in it, not softness exactly, something more solid than softness. Something like certainty. I stood there on the step below her, and I felt something go through me that I can only describe as the opposite of flight. Every time I'd stood at the edge of something good before, something in me had started looking for the door. This time there was no door, or I couldn't find it, or I didn't want to. I said I should come in and talk to your mother. She said, yes, you should, and she stepped back from the door to let me in. I heard Margaret from somewhere in the house say dryly, I heard him from in here. Come in out of the cold. We were married in November, not a large ceremony. Reverend Marsh, who did the church, a handful of people from town, Vander Hoek standing up for me because I didn't have another option and he was a good enough man to do it without making it strange. Margaret cried. Clara didn't, but she took my hand during the words and she held it like she had no intention of letting go, and she didn't. We moved into the house that wasn't quite finished. The first night there was cold. There was a gap around the east window I hadn't sealed yet, and the wind came through it, and I lay awake most of the night thinking about it. Clara slept beside me. She slept like someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it, completely without restlessness, one hand loose near her chin, her breathing even. I'd never seen anyone sleep that peacefully. I'd never been able to myself. At some point in the dark, I got up and went and found some cloth and stuffed it in the gap around the window. Came back. The wind stopped. I lay back down. Clara, without waking fully, turned toward me and put her hand on my arm. I lay there in the dark of my own house with my wife's hand on my arm, and I tried to think of something I was afraid of, and I couldn't name one. Spring of the following year, the valley coming alive again. I'd taken on 2 horses to train for a man over in Raton. Good money, better horses, young ones, smart and sound, barely started. I worked them in the mornings in the field between the house and the creek, and Clara would sometimes come out and watch, standing by the fence with her coffee, and we didn't talk during it, but I was aware of her the whole time the way you're aware of the sun. I was doing well enough that I hired a young man named Theo to help with the work, not much, just a few days a week, but enough that I wasn't alone in it. Theo was 17 and earnest and made mistakes I'd made myself 15 years earlier, and I tried to be patient about it, which Clara later told me I was better at than I thought. That spring I built the proper barn. Not the bones of a barn I'd thrown up the fall before, but a real one, with a hayloft and proper stalls and a tack room. Vander Hoek helped. Purvis came back. A third man I didn't know well named Conwell came because he was building his own barn the following summer and wanted to watch how it was done, which I respected. The day we raised the ridgepole, Vander Hoek said, "You're not going anywhere." I said no. He said good and went back to work. That was all, it was enough. There was a moment that fall, the second fall, that I think about sometimes. We'd been at the homestead helping Margaret with the harvest. She'd expanded the kitchen garden and had more than she could put up alone. We worked all day, the 4 of us if you count Theo who'd come along, and by the end of it we were all tired in the good way that comes from work that matters. And Margaret had made a meal that was better than anything that kitchen produced before or after, I think, because she was in a good mood, and sometimes that's all the difference. I was helping Clara carry things in from the garden, the last of the squash, and we stopped at the door of the root cellar, and she handed me a squash and then just stood there for a moment, looking at the evening light on the hills. I waited. She said, "My father would have liked you." It landed in my chest. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "What makes you think so?" She said, "He respected men who worked without needing to be thanked. Men who made things solid. He was one himself." She paused. "He'd have been glad I found one." I looked at the hills for a moment. I said, "I spent a long time not being anyone who would have been worth finding." She looked at me. That direct look, the one from the general store that first morning years ago. She said, "I don't think that's true. I think you were always worth finding. I think you just didn't believe it." There was nothing to say to that. I put the squash down and I held her face in both my hands, careful, like something I might break, which was foolish because Clara was not a woman you could break. She put her hands on my wrists, and she looked at me like I was something she was sure of. I said, "I'm glad I stopped running." She said, "I know," and then quietly, "So am I." 3 years later, standing at the fence post I'd set myself, my brother Holt laughing at me for saying that about cowboys settling for the right woman. I want to set the record straight on something, because I misspoke and I want to say it correctly. I didn't settle for Clara. Settling is what you do when the thing you got is less than the thing you wanted. That's not what happened. What happened is that I stopped long enough to be worth something. I stopped long enough for a woman who could have had her pick of men to look me over twice and decide I was worth having. What happened is that she saw something in me that I'd been too busy running to show anyone, and maybe too scared to show even myself, and she said yes to it, matter of fact, flower on her hands, standing in her mother's doorway. That's not settling, that's the opposite. What I said to Holt was this, and I'll try to say it better now. Wild cowboys eventually run out of country. And when they do, some of them just stop and look up, and if they're lucky, if they are profoundly, undeservingly lucky, there's a woman standing there who already saw what they were worth. And she decided to wait. I'm 61 now. This morning I went out before sunrise to check the south fence, the same fence I first set 20-some years ago, and the post I tamped down that morning after the wedding is still solid, still plumb, still doing what a good post does. The house is bigger than what I built. We added on twice. The barn is the best-built structure in this part of the valley, and I am not shy about saying so. The horses I've trained have gone to ranches from here to the Montana line. One of them, a gray mare out of the line of that first mare I foaled through the blizzard, won a race in Santa Fe, and the man who rode her sent me a letter about it that I've kept in the tack room under the bridle hooks. Clara is in the house right now. She'll be up, probably making coffee, probably reading that letter from our daughter in Denver that came 2 days ago. The one we've been going over together because our daughter is having a hard season, and we're trying to figure out the right words. I walked back in from the south fence, and the sun came over the east ridge and hit the valley all at once, the way it does, and I stood for a moment in the yard between the barn and the house, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I was running toward the whole time I thought I was running away. I went inside. Clara was at the table, the letter open, coffee made. She looked up. She said, "Fence good." I said, "Post I set 30 years ago is still holding." She said, "Of course it is. You said it." She said it simply. Not flattery, not performance, just the way you say something that's true. I poured my coffee, sat down. She slid the letter toward me. We read it together in the morning light. Outside, the valley was quiet and gold, and going about its business.